The wind howled across the Dakota plains, carrying the scent of rain and the distant clang of metal against hoofbeats. Eleanor Whitmore ran, her breath ragged, her wedding dress torn and heavy with mud. The lace that once symbolized purity and promise now clung to her like a shroud, ripped by brambles and slick with sweat. She dared not look back. Behind her, the dogs bayed, low, guttural sounds that clawed at her resolve. They had picked up her scent. Soon the men would follow. A jagged root caught her foot, and she pitched forward, hands scraping against the cold, wet earth. The pain barely registered. She scrambled up, every muscle burning, pushing forward. She had made it past the ranch's outer fields before the alarm rang out. Isaac Hardin's men had given chase without hesitation. His property had fled, and he would not let her slip through his grasp so easily. The river. She had to reach the river. Somewhere beyond the dense curtain of pine and aspen, the waters churned, swollen from spring's thaw. If she could reach it, if she could find a way across, perhaps she could lose them, perhaps she could disappear. But the land fought her at every step. The trees grew closer, their branches clawing at her veil until it tore free. Her fingers, numb from the cold, barely gripped the edges of her ruined dress as she stumbled downhill. A flash of light split the night. A gunshot. Bark exploded from a nearby tree. She gasped and ducked. Her heart beat a deafening drum. They wouldn't shoot to kill. Not yet. Isaac wanted her alive. The thought of his hands on her again sent a new surge of terror through her veins. She broke into a full sprint. The river roared ahead, black and hungry under the moonlight. She reached the bank just as another shot rang out, the bullet striking the water mere inches from where she stood. No time to think. She lunged forward, the cold embracing her like death itself. The current seized her, dragging her beneath the surface. Water filled her mouth, her lungs. The world spun in a whirl of darkness, but she fought. Kicking, clawing, until she surfaced, gasping. The last thing she saw before the current carried her away was the lanterns of her pursuers flickering like fireflies along the river's edge. Then nothing but the endless pull of the water. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, her body battered against unseen rocks, her mind slipping between panic and exhaustion. When she finally awoke, she lay sprawled on the muddy shore, the sky above her shifting from ink black to the muted gray of dawn. Her limbs refused to move. Cold had seeped into her bones, her dress clinging to her like a second skin. Somewhere, a branch snapped. Her breath hitched. She forced her head to turn, her eyes scanning the woods. A figure stood at the tree line, tall, silent, watching. A man. No, not just a man. A warrior. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Even through her dazed mind, she recognized what he was. Lakota, his long, dark hair hung in braids over broad shoulders. A quiver rested against his back, the fletching of his arrows barely visible in the dim morning light. His chest was bare save for a leather strap, and his gaze, sharp and unyielding, locked onto hers. She had heard the stories. Stories whispered in the drawing rooms of New York before her father sent her west. Stories spoken in hushed tones among the settlers. Tales of warriors who moved like ghosts, who struck without warning. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The warrior took a step forward. Eleanor tried to move, to scramble away, but her body betrayed her. She was too weak. He stopped a few feet from her, his dark eyes unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the distant sound of horses. Eleanor's chest clenched. They were still hunting her. The warrior heard it too, his head tilted slightly, listening. Then he looked down at her, his expression unreadable. She tried to speak, to plead, but only a hoarse whisper escaped her lips. A choice hung between them. He could leave her to her fate, or he could save her. The warrior exhaled slowly, then crouched, his movements deliberate. Without a word, he reached for her. Eleanor flinched, but he didn't hesitate. Strong arms lifted her, as if she weighed nothing. The warmth of his skin was a stark contrast to the chill in her bones. She didn't understand why he was helping her. She didn't know if she could trust him. But trust had never been a choice. Not for her. As he turned and carried her into the woods, the sound of hooves grew louder. The hunt was far from over. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, her body swaying gently, warmth radiating from the arms that carried her. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the river, the weight of exhaustion dragging her under. Now, there was only movement, the steady rhythm of a horse's gait beneath her, and the faint scent of leather and pine. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she found herself wrapped in a heavy buffalo hide, its musky scent foreign but not unpleasant. A fire crackled a few feet away, sending flickering shadows against the towering pines. The world beyond the fire's glow was dark, endless, unfamiliar. She turned her head, and there he was. The Lakota warrior sat on the other side of the fire, sharpening a long knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His expression remained unreadable, his gaze flicking to her only once before returning to his task. Eleanor swallowed, her throat raw. She tried to sit up, but pain lanced through her ribs, stealing her breath. A strangled sound escaped her lips. The warrior stilled, with practiced ease. He set the knife aside and reached for a small clay vessel near the fire. Without a word, he poured a dark liquid into a wooden cup and handed it to her. She hesitated, staring at the offering. His face remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, an expectation, perhaps even a command. She took the cup with trembling fingers and brought it to her lips. The liquid was bitter, thick with unfamiliar herbs, but warmth spread through her almost instantly. She coughed, forcing herself to speak. Where am I?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in heavily accented English, he answered, "Far from the men who hunt you." His voice was deep, steady, as if nothing in this world could shake him. Eleanor shivered, gripping the blanket tighter around herself. "Why did you help me?" He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I saw you." She frowned. "You saw me." His gaze didn't waver. "Alone, running, afraid." He picked up his knife again and resumed sharpening it. "I have seen animals hunted the same way." The word sent a chill through her. Eleanor lowered the cup, staring at the flames. She had spent her life surrounded by wealth, by rules, by the expectation that she would marry well and be an obedient wife. But out here, none of that mattered. She had been reduced to something primal, something that fled, something that bled, and he had seen it. She wanted to feel anger at his comparison, but she couldn't. He wasn't wrong. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of his blade against stone. Finally, she found her voice again. "What is your name?" He hesitated, as if considering whether to answer. Then, without looking up, he said, "Tashunka Wapaha." She tried to repeat it, but the foreign syllables tangled on her tongue. "Tashunka." He glanced at her then, his expression flickering with something close to amusement. "It means horse shield." Eleanor nodded slowly. It suited him, strong, unyielding, a protector. Another gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the branches like whispers in the dark. She tightened the hide around her shoulders, suddenly aware of the vast emptiness surrounding them. The wilderness had no walls, no locked doors, nothing to keep danger at bay. She turned back to him. "Where are we going?" Tashunka set his knife down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Away from the men who hunt you, to the hills." She swallowed hard. And then, for the first time, something like hesitation crossed his face. "Then you must decide." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. The truth settled over her like a weight. She had nowhere to go. Returning to Isaac Hardin was unthinkable. But she was not Lakota, and she did not belong in this world either. The realization made her stomach twist. Tashunka watched her, his gaze unreadable. He had already made his decision. He had chosen to save her. But her fate was still her own. The fire crackled between them, the night stretching long and uncertain. Dawn broke in streaks of gold and crimson, painting the sky with fragile beauty. Eleanor stirred, feeling the stiffness in her limbs before she fully woke. Tashunka was already moving, saddling his horse with quick efficiency. The remnants of their small camp had been packed away, The fire smothered into nothing more than a darkened patch of earth. She pushed herself upright, wincing as pain flared through her ribs. Tushunka noticed. He walked over and knelt beside her, studying her injuries with furrowed brow. "You cannot ride far like this." Eleanor set her jaw. "I don't have a choice." He didn't argue. Instead, he stood and extended a hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. His grip was firm, steady, and he pulled at her feet with ease. They rode in silence, the vast wilderness stretching before them. The further they went, the more Eleanor realized how little she truly understood this land. The trees whispered secrets in the wind. The distant howl of a wolf sent shivers down her spine, and the endless sky felt both freeing and terrifying. Tushunka guided the horse with effortless skill, his posture relaxed yet alert. He belonged to this world in a way she never could. A thought nagged at her. "Why are you alone?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, he said, "War." The single word carried a weight she couldn't begin to comprehend. She had heard whispers in town, of battles, of massacres, of soldiers and warriors clashing over land that neither side would surrender. But those were distant things, stories told over dinner tables by men who had never set foot on the frontier. Now, she was looking at someone who had lived it. She wanted to ask more, but something in his expression warned her not to. They rode until the sun hung high overhead, stopping only when they reached a small stream tucked between two ridges. Tushunka dismounted first, offering her his hand again. Eleanor ignored the gesture. She was sore, exhausted, but she would not be helpless. Gritting her teeth, she slid from the horse's back, barely suppressing a gasp as her legs nearly buckled beneath her. Tushunka didn't comment. Instead, he handed her a strip of dried meat and a waterskin before leading the horse to drink. She chewed slowly, her gaze drifting over the landscape. "Do you have a family?" she asked. He hesitated. "Once." The answer was enough. She didn't press him further. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken things. For the first time in days, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe. The hunt was behind them, for now, but the road ahead remained uncertain. She had escaped one prison only to find herself in another, a vast, open one, with no clear path forward. Yet, as she glanced at Tushunka, she wondered if perhaps she was not as alone as she had once thought. The wind carried the scent of rain and distant smoke as Eleanor tightened her grip on the horse's reins. Days had passed since she had escaped the clutches of Isaac Harden, since Tushunka Wappa had plucked her from the river's edge and led her deeper into the untamed wilds. In that time, she had learned to move with the land, to listen to its whispers, but she had also learned fear, the kind that lingered even in silence. Tushunka had grown more cautious. His eyes often flicked toward the horizon, his body tense at the slightest unnatural sound. She could feel it, too, the unseen threat that followed them like a shadow. They stopped near a rocky outcrop as the sun dipped below the hills, bathing the land in hues of crimson and gold. Tushunka dismounted first, scanning the terrain with a sharp, practiced gaze. "We do not camp here," he murmured. Eleanor swallowed. "Why? What is it?" "Riders. Not far." A chill ran down her spine. The men who hunted her had not given up. They pressed on under the cover of dusk, moving through a narrow ravine where the air felt thick and suffocating. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. The deeper they went, the more the walls of stone seemed to close in, the night pressing down on them. Then she heard it, the crack of a branch, the distant whinny of a horse. Tushunka pulled his mount to a halt. His hand went to the knife at his waist, his body rigid. The silence stretched, thick with tension. A voice echoed to the ravine, low and mocking. "You've run far, Eleanor, but not far enough." Her blood turned to ice. A figure stepped from the shadows, torchlight flickering against the hard planes of his face. Isaac Harden. Eleanor's breath hitched. He looked unchanged, yet somehow crueler, his dark eyes gleaming with triumph. Behind him, half a dozen men emerged, rifles slung over their shoulders, their expressions cold. Tushunka didn't move. He was stone, waiting, measuring. Isaac tilted his head. You think you can hide out here forever? That an Indian can protect you?" His lip curled. "Come now, Eleanor. You were meant for better things than this." She clenched her fists, anger burning away the terror. "You don't own me, Isaac." He smiled, slow and deliberate. "Oh, but I do." His eyes flicked at Tushunka. "And I'll pay handsomely for what's mine." The words made her stomach churn. Tushunka remained silent, unmoving. But Eleanor saw it. The faint shift of his stance, the tightening of his grip. Isaac sighed. "A shame, really. You could have had everything, Eleanor." He gestured lazily, and in an instant, the crack of gunfire split the night. Tushunka moved before she could think, seizing her arm and pulling her behind him. The bullet ricocheted off the rock beside them, sending shards of stone flying. Then the world erupted into chaos. Tushunka sprang forward, swift as a shadow, his knife flashing in the firelight. He struck the first man before he could aim, driving the blade deep into his gut. The man choked, eyes wide with shock, before collapsing. Eleanor stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Another shot rang out. Tushunka twisted, narrowly dodging the bullet as he lunged at the next attacker, knocking the rifle from his hands. The canyon became a blur of violence, shouts, gunfire, the sickening clash of steel against flesh. Eleanor's gaze darted to Isaac. He stood apart from the fray, watching, waiting. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, but he did not draw it. Not yet. A shape loomed before her, one of Isaac's men, his face twisted with malice. He grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward. Panic surged through her. She struggled, twisting, clawing, but his grip was iron. Then Tushunka was there. With a single motion, he drove his knife into the man's throat. Blood sprayed across the dirt. The man staggered, gurgled, and fell. Tushunka turned to her, his breath heavy. "Run." She hesitated, her eyes locking onto his. Another shot rang out. Tushunka jerked back, a sharp grunt escaping his lips. Eleanor's world slowed. She saw it, the dark stain spreading across his side, the way his body stiffened. Isaac lowered his smoking revolver, smiling. Eleanor felt something break inside her. Tushunka didn't fall. He turned, eyes burning with fury, and lunged. Isaac barely had time to react before Tushunka slammed into him, sending them both crashing to the ground. They grappled in the dirt, fists flying, the knife flashing between them. Eleanor moved before she could think. She seized a fallen rifle, her hands trembling as she lifted it. Isaac had pinned Tushunka, his fingers tightening around his throat. She aimed. The shot cracked through the night. Isaac's body jerked. His grip loosened. He slumped to the side, eyes wide with shock. Tushunka gasped for breath, shoving Isaac's lifeless body away. Silence fell. The remaining men, seeing their leader dead, hesitated. Then they turned and fled, disappearing into the night. Eleanor dropped the rifle, her chest heaving. She sank to her knees beside Tushunka, pressing her hands against his wound. His skin was slick with blood, but his gaze remained steady, locked onto hers. "You saved me," she whispered. His lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "We save each other." The words settled deep in her chest. The night stretched around them, heavy with the scent of blood and gunpowder. Somewhere in the distance, the first hint of dawn touched the sky. But Eleanor knew one thing. The battle was over. For now. The first rays of dawn stretched long fingers across the land, casting the canyon in hues of pale gold and deep violet. Eleanor sat beside Tushunka, pressing torn fabric against the wound at his side, her hands slick with his blood. He did not flinch, did not make a sound, though his breath came slow and deliberate, his body rigid with pain. She had seen men wounded before, soldiers returning from distant wars, drifters who had staggered into town with bullet holes and stories half-spoken. But this was different. This was a man who had risked everything for her, a man she had nearly lost. Tushunka exhaled, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "You should go." Eleanor's hand stilled. The words cut deeper than any wound. "Go." She shook her head. "You think I'd just leave you here?" His jaw tightened. "More will come." She knew he was right. Isaac was dead, but death did not erase debts. The men who had followed him, those who had fled into the night, would not forget, and neither would the law. She swallowed hard. Then we don't stay. Tushunka studied her for a long moment. There was something unreadable in his gaze, something weighing, measuring. Finally, he gave a slow nod. Eleanor worked quickly, binding his wound as best she could before helping him onto his horse. He swayed but caught himself, gripping the reins with steady hands. The sight of him, injured, bloodstained, but unbowed, sent something fierce and unrelenting through her veins. She climbed onto the saddle behind him, wrapping her arms carefully around his waist. Then they rode. The land stretched vast and unending before them, a sea of rolling hills and towering pines. The morning air was crisp, laced with the scent of damp earth and distant rain. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary. There was only the rhythm of the horse's hooves, the steady rise and fall of Tushunka's breath, and the weight of the pass bearing down upon them. By midday, they reached the edge of a wooded valley, a place where the trees grew dense and the world felt untouched. Here, the whispers of pursuit faded, swallowed by the vastness of the wild. Eleanor helped Tushunka from the saddle, guiding him to a small stream where he could drink. His hands, usually so sure and steady, trembled slightly as he cupped the water. She sat beside him, exhaustion pressing heavily upon her. "What now?" He did not answer at first. Instead, he watched the water, the way it moved, always forward, never still. Finally he spoke. "There's a place, a village, hidden in the hills. My people." Eleanor's heart pounded. "Will they help us?" Tushunka's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "They will help me." She understood the meaning beneath the words. She was not one of them, and though he had saved her, though they had fought and bled together, there were walls that even sheer hardship could not easily break. Still she nodded. "Then we go." They rested only briefly, before pressing on. The journey was slow, the weight of injury and exhaustion dragging at them, but they did not stop. They could not. As dusk settled upon the land, the world around them began to shift. The air carried the scent of wood smoke. The distant murmur of voices drifted through the trees. And then, through the thinning branches, Eleanor saw it. A gathering of lodges, their hide coverings painted with symbols she could not yet understand. A place untouched by the world she had fled. A place where she did not belong. They were seen before they entered. Shadows moved between the lodges, figures stepping forward, their gazes sharp, wary. A man approached, older, his face lined with years of wisdom and war. His gaze swept over Eleanor before settling on Tushunka. Words were exchanged in the Lakota tongue, swift and clipped. Eleanor did not understand them, but she did not need to. She saw the flicker of recognition in the older man's eyes, the shift from wariness to something softer, something pained. Tushunka's father. She stayed silent as more figures emerged, gathering like the wind before a storm. Their eyes lingered on her, unreadable, filled with questions she could not answer. Then a woman stepped forward, her presence commanding. She was older than Eleanor, her dark hair streaked with silver, her expression unreadable. She spoke, and though Eleanor did not understand the words, the meaning was clear. "Why is she here?" Tushunka answered, his voice steady but edged with something unyielding. "A challenge, a claim." Silence followed. Then, at last, the woman nodded. Eleanor exhaled, only now realizing she had been holding her breath. They were led to a lodge near the edge of the village. Inside, the space was warm, the scent of sage and earth filling the air. Tushunka was guided to a bed of furs, and before Eleanor could react, the older woman motioned for her to leave. She hesitated, glancing at Tushunka, but he met her gaze and gave a faint nod. She stepped outside, the cool air wrapping around her. For the first time in days, she was truly alone. The village bustled with quiet life around her, but she was apart from it, an outsider standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. She did not know how long she stood there, staring at the darkening sky, before footsteps approached. She turned to find Tushunka's father watching her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in heavily accented English, he spoke. "You saved my son." Eleanor swallowed. "He saved me first." The old man studied her. "You do not belong here." She knew it was not meant as cruelty. It was truth spoken plainly. Her throat tightened. "I have nowhere else to go." Silence stretched between them. Then, with a slow nod, the old man turned and walked away, leaving her with nothing but the wind and the weight of her own uncertainty. Inside the lodge, Tashuka slept, his breathing, even his body at rest. Eleanor sank onto furs beside him, exhaustion pressing down upon her. She did not know what the future held, did not know if she would ever truly find a place in this world. But she knew one thing: she had survived. And for now, that was enough.